MultiGreen, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the MultiGreen podcast. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Executive Director of YIMBY Action, Laura Foote. An authority on effective housing in the United States, Laura is one of the key founders of YIMBY, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. YIMBY is becoming an international movement. Over the past 8 years, Laura has grown YIMBY Action into a thriving grassroots political organization with 20 chapters in cities across the country and more than 3,000 supporters nationwide. As an economist, she understands the externalities of housing, the law of supply and demand, and as a leader, she understands how to turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs. Enjoy our conversation. Laura Foote, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to give a little bit of background to our listeners, specifically about you. You are definitely an authority on housing activism in the United States and abroad. And in 2014, you are one of the founders of this YIMBY movement. In fact, you're an executive director at YIMBY Action, and you have been growing this organization now up to over 3,000 supporters, over 20 chapters in the United States, and you have a specialization in economics as a graduate of Hamilton College. I guess being a trained economist, you must understand the many externalities when it comes to housing, right? The affordability and attainability of housing today, is it a supply and demand issue?
Yeah, it's funny that so I don't often talk about my econ undergrad because I sort of feel like an undergraduate degree in economics is just enough econ to get you into trouble, where you really think you know what you're talking about, but you haven't actually done the next level of deeper studies. But yeah, I mean, I think that for housing, there's a clear lack of supply, and there's a clear evidence, and there's tons and tons of evidence that the US has been chronically underbuilding housing for decades. And you don't have to have an undergraduate degree in economics in order to be able to see that we clearly have a lack of supply, and especially a lack of housing supply in places where we have a growing economy. Every major American city that is producing jobs and opportunity, every place where we have good schools and where people could thrive, those are exactly the places where we're underproducing housing, and people are engaging in mega commuting. You know, there's all these externalities that then come once you recognize that there is this core feature of America where we've underproduced housing in opportunity-rich places for decades.
There's a stat I want to share from the National Multifamily Housing Council, and it says that the U.S. needs to build, on average, about 328,000 new apartments every year by 2030 just to meet the expected future demand. And this does not account for the past few years that we've begun producing, more homes, but this is only addressing the existing demand. There's many years of undersupply. Do you see that in your markets that you're focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, this is one thing that I think, and I'll assume that this audience is a little nerdier than most of the audiences I'm talking to, but we have these kinds of two parts of our economy. We have the market economy, where you can see it in high housing costs and high rents. And we also have the part of our economy that's a little bit more socialist, where we have subsidized affordable housing, where people are on long wait lists. So in San Francisco, if you're trying to get into subsidized affordable housing, the average wait time to get into those units is about 10 years. They call it a lottery because you are very unlikely to win the housing lottery. So both of those halves of our economy, we have different ways of measuring, like, do we have a shortage? Long lines is the traditional way you measure a shortage in a more socialist economy, and high prices is the way you measure a shortage in a more market-based economy. Because we have this hybrid economy, we have both. We have both people scrambling, doing everything they can to get into subsidized affordable housing. We also have all kinds of other overcrowding people, and especially I think this jobs housing mismatch, we do have some amount of more affordable housing sprawled out far away from our jobs and opportunity. And so people are engaging in mega commuting. That's another way that we can measure what are the other costs that people incur that are sort of, you could sort of sum into a cost of living. People are, spending a lot on gas, and certainly people complaining about gas prices. That's another piece of the housing crisis, that people have to live so far away from where their jobs are.
Yeah, you've nailed it. There's so many externalities and economic issues, and I love the way that you explain that. Again, don't underestimate yourself. You are explaining Economics 101 very well. I first came across your work in the New York Times when Connor Doherty published an article summarizing his book, Golden Gates, Fighting for Housing in America. And this article was an excerpt from the book, and the article was titled Build, 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 Build.
I think there were like 3 more builds there.
Was there more?
I think it was like build, 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 build. Yeah, he had like 18 builds in there.
I loved it, and it caught my eye. And it was my first encounter with YIMBY and the YIMBY movement. How did you and the author Connor Doherty first meet?
Oh gosh, I actually have no idea. I bet Connor has notes on it. But my, partner in activism, Sonja Trauss, had been active. One of the first kind of early radical things we did was there was a proposal for building an apartment building in a city called Lafayette, and which is sort of a wealthy suburb outside of San Francisco. And that proposal got shot down by the local government, who then instead want to convince the developer, instead of building that multifamily housing, why don't you build, I think it was like 40 single family homes, which was in keeping with the cultural context of Lafayette, which is wealthy single family homes. There was a sort of unused law, the Housing Accountability Act, that it was, it was a normal practice. It still is a normal practice for local governments to just reject housing proposals, whether that's legal or not. And developers are very hesitant to sue because you have to keep doing business in that town, right? It's not like you're going to just get your permits and then not have an ongoing relationship with that community. You have to get a lot of permits. You don't just get the building permits, you also have to get the dig a hole permit and every other permit. So that's a long-term relationship with a city that they're very hesitant to sue, but we're assholes. So we were like, no, we want to see that housing get built. We don't want to see 40 single family homes. And so Sonja sued the city of Lafayette, which also happens to be where some of my family lives. They were not pleased. So I was actually, at the time, it was my boyfriend's family. And so, the relationship was a little tenuous, and they were really displeased with the fact that, yeah, it was a little bit of internal family drama as well. But, I think Connor, that and other activism we were doing caught Connor's eye, and he decided to start following us around. He followed us around as we did a lot of activism, trying to get State Senator Scott Wiener elected. He sort of was like, oh, these people are cool, and followed us around for quite a few months as we were, and eventually it became the book Golden Gates.
Well, that's great context and great background. And earlier in this season, we also interviewed Connor, and he referenced the YIMBY Action movement. Can you explain to the listeners the meaning of NIMBY, and in contrast, what is YIMBY?
Yeah, so NIMBY, not in my backyard. It's a gut instinct that a lot of people have about saying, a proposed change is happening, and people will say, well, not in my backyard. What's kind of interesting about not in my backyard that I kind of like is that it's still an acknowledgement that maybe we do need this thing, right? Not in my backyard doesn't say this is a terrible thing necessarily, although some people go the next step further, which is the joke is that it's bananas, build absolutely nothing near anyone ever, bananas. But the acronym NIMBY, I think somewhere in the back of their mind often does acknowledge that maybe this is an important thing. I just don't want it near me. And so I think of NIMBYism is more of like a disease sometimes, and it has triggers that part of the way we make decisions about land use and the way we have, the way our process of decision making in America takes place triggers NIMBYism. We make one set of decisions about what are we going to allow and where, but then we have a process where once something within that rules framework is actually proposed, you have a hearing, you debate, even though it might totally follow the existing rules, you are going to relitigate and have that decision made again. And that triggers people's NIMBYism, right? Where they're like, oh, well, if you're asking me, should this happen near me? No. That has led to a chronic housing shortage that I'm sure we'll ramble on about later in this podcast. The chronic housing shortage has sort of led to a group of people who are increasingly hysterical about the fact that this chronic housing shortage is causing just huge amounts of damage across the country, and personal experiences as well. I mean, I moved to San Francisco in 2000, I want to say 14, 13. And as I sort of looked at the cost of housing, everyone around me was struggling. All of my friends had stories. I had a friend who was staying with a hoarder. I had a friend who was living with an ex-boyfriend where the relationship was deteriorating. And they felt trapped. They couldn't leave because they needed to stay in the apartment that they were in. Those emotions and those experiences have led people to this kind of class consciousness that we need a lot more housing. And that's sort of where the YIMBY movement, we sort of put a name to it. Okay, in order to overcome not in my backyard, we're going to need an organized movement of people saying yes, saying, please build this housing near us. And that's where the YIMBY movement really started. It's a grassroots activist movement, and YIMBY Action is just one of several other pro-housing groups now across the country. And we really focus on helping people, when they're at that moment where they're like, oh my God, this whole thing is driving me totally crazy. How do we get more housing built? We help you start an organization, start a chapter, and fight back against the NIMBYism that is definitely happening in your community. Like, you may not be going to planning commission hearings, but I guarantee you the NIMBYs are already there and they are saying no to everything.
That's right. When I was researching YIMBY and this YIMBY Action movement, I was trying to differentiate between the two for the benefit of our listeners and for me. Can you go one step further and explain the difference between YIMBY and YIMBY Action as they potentially research this on the internet?
Yeah, so the YIMBY movement is bigger than just YIMBY Actions. So there are people who are just like, I'm a YIMBY out in the world. I think it's like the environmental movement, right? Where you have anything that's a movement, you have a bunch of people who are saying we have to make these changes. They're part of the broader conversation. And then there are also, organized groups as well. So I'll do shout outs to people who I think are doing really great work. Abundant Housing LA, A Better Cambridge, and Abundant Housing Massachusetts. There's a big long list. And California YIMBY, there's a lot of organizations that are doing activism either in their local community or carrying important bills. And then YIMBY Action, we have about, I think it's now 25 chapters that each also have local brands. So YIMBY Denver is a chapter of YIMBY Action. They're doing activism in their community. People for Housing, Orange County, Peninsula for Everyone. It's always fun to be like, yes, there is a YIMBY movement in Orange County, California, that is saying we need to make Orange County more inclusive. I hope that explains kind of the difference, but I think we're part of that broader pro-housing movement.
Great. I'm going to just reiterate something that you mentioned. So you support abundant housing, of course, all income levels, including affordable and market rate housing. Does this mean that YIMBY Action strives to support the vast majority of housing projects, or are there some projects you will support and versus not support?
Yeah, we think that when we're more pro infill than sprawl, I think part of the reason why people are still doing sprawl projects is because it's so hard to build infill. So I'm not as harsh on sprawl as some of the more hardcore environmentalists, but what we also often see is like sometimes densifying an existing suburb gets labeled as sprawl when it really isn't. I think that's one thing that we really do want to densify existing suburbs, but we don't want to pave over the earth. I mean, I think Houston is an interesting model for us where there's sort of Texas cities where they require a lot of parking and have done a lot of sprawl that has made things more affordable, but has not actually made the city function very well because it's not dense enough to support enough of small businesses and walkability. And we're definitely much more in the let's have dense, vibrant, sustainable communities that aren't all based around the automobile. There are also projects we think that it is really possible to do both, build a lot of housing and have strong tenants protections. I mean, I think part of this is we're a consumer advocacy movement. So we're the people who want to live in housing advocating. We believe that increasing supply is a key component of that. We also think that there has to be reasonable tenant protections to make sure that we're always doing development without displacement, so that you're not just tearing down existing low-income old housing and building maybe exactly the same number of condos in its place. Those are the kinds of projects we wouldn't support. We really, there's always a parking lot next door that we can put a giant multifamily apartment building on. I think that's our basic framework is we need strong tenant protections and abundant housing. And the strongest tenant protection is abundant housing, where if you have a conflict with your landlord, you can say, thank you very much. I'm moving into the apartment building next door because you suck. And that is a very strong tenant protection. I think this is, in addition, we want other kinds of tenant protections, but the strongest one is the ability to walk away. In most cities in America right now, tenants don't have the ability to walk away. It's you really feel that sense of being trapped.
That makes a lot of sense. What projects will YIMBY prioritize, if any?
Multifamily housing, near transit is definitely something we prioritize, but also we prioritize in really exclusionary communities. So if you've got a wealthy community, even if it maybe doesn't have transit, but that's built almost no housing, has a great school district and has a lot of opportunity in that community. And, I think we'll fight for that little duplex in a rich community. I think part of what we're doing, the project by project advocacy is important, but it's also really important to help shape the narrative and expose what's actually happening. So getting people active for an individual project is also a storytelling experience where people realize, what does housing have to go up against in order to actually get through the gauntlet? So we pick projects. Yes, we support a lot of projects, but we really pick projects that we're going to put the full force of the activist movement behind, sometimes based on projects where the opponents are really awful. There's been recent controversy in Berkeley about student housing, and the opponents of student housing have really made themselves into quite ghoulish characters. And I think that it's frequently that's what happens, right? You've got people who I think are fundamentally wanting to steal the future from other people in order to preserve what they believe is theirs and really pull up the ladder of opportunity behind them is just wild. And so we will prioritize projects where the opponents really make themselves quite ghoulish. And I think that it's an important part of the storytelling of kind of exposing. I had a NIMBY tell me that the thing they were most upset about is that their kids and grandkids thought that it was unacceptable that they were opposing housing. And I was like, yes, that is the change that I want to see, where you realize that opposing housing in your community is an antisocial activity.
It's happening nationwide. It's definitely happening in the projects that we're pursuing as well. How does YIMBY Action and the work that you're doing support projects specifically?
Yeah, so we have on our website a little like project support request form where we get the information about the project. And then depending on how much capacity we have in that area, we might do something as simple as sending a letter of support saying, hey, we support this project. Also, there are a lot of laws that developers are hesitant to invoke that say maybe this project, it's actually illegal to disallow this project. So we have a legal arm as well that will look at any project submission and say, and talk with the developer and say, hey, would you like us to remind the local city that in fact they don't have the right to disallow this project under law, and it doesn't have to be associated with you. It can just be us reminding them that laws exist and that we will sue them. So that's one part of it. And then in places where we have a, thriving grassroots movement, we're creating petitions, and it's all the stuff that NIMBYs do, right? If you have a project and you have project opponents, which I'm sure you do, you know what they do. We just do it for yes. So we do petitions to support the project. We post on social media. We get our army of activists to come out to public comment and speak out in favor of projects. We do all the stuff that the opponents often do, that the NIMBYs are doing. We show up at public hearings. We give public comment. We have a public comment training where we get people ready and excited to share their personal message about why they support housing. We do petitions and letter writing campaigns. And I think what has a bigger long-term impact, and why do we do chapters and why do we do this like deeper level of organizing, is that elected officials and planning commissioners, when they're looking at the project opponents, they're also looking at voters. They're looking at people who they think are going to punish them at the ballot box long-term, who are going to have house parties for their opponents and all this kind of stuff. So it adds a lot of weight to the opposition often. And we have to do the same thing for YIMBY. So we get involved in local politics. We endorse local candidates. This is part of growing your political strength, and your influence is about supporting individual pieces of legislation and getting pro-housing people elected and changing the minds of local elected officials. Part of it is making a good argument, and part of it is demonstrating that you have an organized voting bloc that prioritizes this issue, that's going to show up over and over and over again, that's going to canvass for candidates, that's going to do phone banks, that's going to throw house parties, all of that stuff. And that's why that deeper level of organizing really matters. That stuff has a deep long-term impact on whether a local government feels comfortable saying yes or saying no to housing. I think that when we're thinking about the long-term growth of the YIMBY movement, we're going to have to do a lot of that local organizing. It's a lot. We also have to get higher levels of government, different people elected, so that we can really change systemically how we make these kinds of decisions. Because when you start, part of the fundamental problem is that we're starting with a segregated society where some people have opportunity. And this didn't happen accidentally. This happened, deliberately. We had explicitly racist policies that helped white people buy homes. We had an entire system of mortgages that were only available to white families. We had white flight out to the suburbs. We had this entire system of government of explicitly racist policies that reinforced segregation, and it really did buoy white wealth. And when we made it illegal to be explicitly racist in our housing policies, when we got rid of redlining, what happened is that communities didn't wake up the next day and be like, oh, great, racism over. We're going to open up the doors and make our communities so inclusive. No. What they did is they figured out implicit ways to maintain that segregation. They downzoned, they made the permitting process excruciating. You can see through the 70s, especially, this systematic downzoning after a lot of the Civil Rights Act movement was passed, this systematic downzoning and making our communities more exclusionary and making the permitting process just worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. all as this way of pulling up the ladder of opportunity into these communities and pulling the decision-making down to the lowest level of government where they were still segregated, where they could still maintain control. And a lot of that history, it's like the current batch of NIMBYs don't realize, that they're not saying like, oh, I want to keep my community, but they use this coded language, neighborhood character. Well, there's sort of a thing YIMBYs say like, well, your neighborhood character is racism. So like, do you really want to keep your neighborhood character if your neighborhood character is systemic racism? I mean, I don't know, maybe you do. But I think that this is part of the fundamental problem, is that systemic racism is really hard to call out because it's not an individual maybe being like, I don't want a person of color moving into my community. It's an entire system of decision-making that selects for people being afraid of change, people being afraid of newcomers, and having all of that draped in reasonableness. Well, I'm not opposed to these things. I just have concerns. I just want to talk through my concerns. And that entire system really does have this overall impact of maintaining segregation, maintaining exclusionary communities where opportunity, you have to buy, we made so many communities into country clubs. You buy your way in, or you marry in, or you get born into it. And that is the story of most wealthy communities in America. It is expensive by design, and a big part of that history is the racism of housing in America.
I would like to throw out maybe 2 books as a recommendation. On our reading list here internally at MultiGreen, we require everybody to read The Color of Law, and the other book is Evicted. And I think it really showcases some of the things you've just mentioned.
And another one I think is really great for people, Segregated by Design. That's another really great one as well.
Excellent suggestion. I have not read that, and I'm going to add it to the list.
Oh, and add Neighborhood Defenders too. That's, if you want to get into the psychology of anti-housing people, Neighborhood Defenders is the ultimate book on that.
Yes, I love it. Thank you so much for those suggestions. Speaking about some of these bills and administrative changes that you've supported over the last few years, it kind of is a natural segue of some of the changes in progress I think that we're seeing. Can you opine on some of those activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we've had, where the YIMBY movement grew from and where we've had the most progress, and I do want to kind of like, we helped get specific state senators elected, right? And what did they do? Once you get, your housing champions in your state legislatures, I want to throw out some bills, but I also think that for anybody who's thinking about, okay, well, how do we get this bill passed in another state? It's like, you got to organize, you got to support candidates. There's all this pre-work also before, but you might have a state senator or a state assembly person or, a champion who's just chomping on the bit and waiting for you. So God bless if you have that person. But we helped elect a few people. And some of the bills that have been really impactful are bills around like a state density bonus, where if you build a little bit more subsidized affordable housing, you can build faster and you can sort of get through a lot of the nonsense process, and you can build taller. You get a handful of what are called variances, where you can tweak, a lot of the ways that the zoning is overly restrictive is that in order to actually build a project, you need adjustments to the zoning, which are often called variances. Anyway, this is a nerdy audience. I can go there.
Absolutely.
So there's state density bonuses. So, SB 35. We've also last year helped pass in California a bill that legalized building duplexes and splitting lots across the state. There's a lot of little bills that helped legalize accessory dwelling units, also known as backyard cottages or granny flats, making it easier to convert garages into housing units. There's a bunch of little bills that help with that. There's also been a strengthening of this big process in California that has never worked before, but is, going to show some hope this time, because we passed a bunch of little laws to help strengthen this process, called the housing element process. And the basic idea is California needs a metric fuck ton of housing, a lot. And so we have that need. Then it gets divvied out amongst the various regions of California. Everybody gets in their cog is what they're called, but gets a little block of housing that then gets distributed to the individual cities. So here's your housing goal. You have to go update your zoning, your general plan to show us a credible plan that you're actually going to hit that housing goal over the next 8 years. So this process has, as you can imagine, been kind of a joke in California previously, where the cities come up with creative ways to look like they're trying to hit their goals, but they like upzone a swamp or upzone a, long-term business that they know is not actually going to change over. But we've strengthened that process. We've made the state agency is actually going to be cracking down and has rejected a bunch of these plans as not credible. We're going to have some consequences for cities being out of compliance and not having credible plans for achieving these housing goals. And it opens up the possibility for, if you're out of compliance, what's called a builder's remedy, where a project can move forward over the objections of the city when they are out of compliance with their, they're supposed to have this credible plan for achieving their housing goals. All of this is called the housing element process. We have this campaign for fair housing elements where we have hundreds of volunteers across the state paying attention to what the local governments are doing, basically tattling on them to the state agency, saying, here are all the things that the local government did on purpose in order to not actually comply with your law. The state agency is very interested in this information for the first time ever, because we have a pro-housing governor who has told the state agency, I actually want you to enforce this stuff. We have a pro-housing attorney general, Rob Bonta, who is suing cities, or and for now he's mostly just sending them threatening letters that they just then back down about. You should follow Attorney General Rob Bonta on Twitter, because he loves when he's cracking down on cities. It's there on Twitter every time, because he knows that there is a whole group now of activists who want him to be doing that work. I mean, I think that's the sort of like the important thing is it's weird to have a place where like the attorney general is my hero. Like he's actually enforcing the law. That kind of cultural change in how a bureaucracy operates happens because you've done so much grassroots activism. You have a bunch of people paying attention to this. And it's possible in other states. I think California has taken good steps in the right direction. Obviously, it's not a lot easier to build in California than it was 5 years ago, but that change is on the horizon. I think we can really see that the administrative and legal changes are happening to make I'm much more hopeful about what's going to happen in the next 5 years.
I've seen the change. I've seen a much more positive reaction to developers and property owners wanting to go into California. And I think that work needs to be credited to you and organizations that are pro-housing. Good job.
Oh, I hope so. I'm like knocking on wood as you say that.
So Laura, in your 2021 YIMBY Impact Report, it says that you supported over 5,500 homes, 2,500 homes of which received letters, and I believe 1,564 homes were approved. So looking forward to 2030, what would YIMBY look like, and what would be defined as a successful outcome for you?
It's funny. I feel like you expect me to say we would send more letters, but my 2030 goal is that we send 0 letters, because all housing is permitted by rights, and we do not have to send any project-based letters. Now, I think that's probably, 2030. Like we could see a big society-wide change across America. I'm gonna hope for that. The goals that we really set for ourselves are around membership growth, around chapter growth. The thing about politics is when you have a strong activist base, you take the bite that you can take when you can take it, and you don't always necessarily know which bite that's going to be. The housing element process is not something I was paying attention to 3 years ago, 5 years ago. It was something that was a real failure in California. The housing element process didn't work. Now we have made enough changes to that process that we can really use that to fight for abundant housing in California. I don't know right now what the possibility is going to be. I know how we get there. The way we get there is by growing a vibrant grassroots movement and by getting people elected. I didn't know that the Attorney General was going to be this like hero for us, which has been great. When you do this kind of big cultural shift, part of what we're doing is, we're creating a parade. And when you create a parade, elected officials get to the front of that parade. They want people to clap for them. And they're going to be, I have a bunch of ideas about what a lot of the specific solutions are going to be, but they have to be flexible enough to change when new political opportunities open up. I hope in 2030 we have to focus more on transit because we've solved housing in America, right? I want us to have actually changed the framework for how we permit and zone for housing, that we don't have to talk about permitting and zoning anymore. That, frankly, that we have podcasts where it's like any idiot can build a duplex, right? I mean, not a true idiot, right? But like, I want a world where if you follow the rules, you get your permits. You don't have to have special knowledge of the permitting process. You don't have to hire a permit expediter. You don't have to hire a high-paid lawyer, because the rules are the rules. And if you follow the rules, because housing is a good thing, it's a thing we want more of. I want housing to be something, that we're doing everything as government as possible to encourage the production of housing and seeing it as a resource in our communities.
In this same report, the 2021 YIMBY Impact Report, you're quoted by saying that almost every single week in 2021, you received, or the YIMBY group received, an email from someone in America who wanted to start advocating for housing in their community and wanted your help specifically. How can you help? How can I help? What is the path forward?
Yeah, I think this is depending on what your background and what energy you have to give. Obviously, I run a nonprofit, so donations, we love donations. And becoming a member is a great first step. Advocating in your community can take a lot of different forms. Writing an op-ed in your local paper. I think especially for people who run housing companies, you all have a whole community of people who care about your project, who I think are often not seen as important stakeholders, right? Your architect and everybody who's working on that team, they are also members of the community. They are also people who could be speaking out, not just for your housing project, but for every housing project that's proposed in their community. I think that activating your network, your friends, talking about why housing matters, sharing articles, obviously it's great if you're getting them on our lists, right? If you're like creating petitions that support your individual housing project, and sharing them around. I think that a lot of developers, especially, they want to live in this world where they don't quite want to admit that they're in politics.
Yes.
And it's like, I feel bad, like housing has been politicized. Developers don't get to decide if they want to be in politics or not. You're in politics. You're trying to do something that other people are not going to want you to do, and they're going to use administrative and legal frameworks to stop you from building in their community, and they're going to feel very entitled to be doing that. And I think a lot of developers end up feeling very like apologetic, as if they're like, trying to do offer children cigarettes or something. I'm like, no, you're trying to build apartments. This is a thing we need. You are trying to build homes. That is a noble profession. I want you to be proud of that fact and to not be trying to, I think that there's so much appeasing of the NIMBYs that happens. There's so much paying off of the that happens, that then you're like funding the future opposition to more housing projects. That part drives me crazy. Is the NIMBY movement is far more funded by developers than the YIMBY movement. The YIMBY movement is funded by our grassroots activists paying their membership fees. The anti-housing people are getting paid to go away all the time. It drives me crazy. But I do think that this opportunity exists for radicalizing and for being proud of the fact that housing is so desperately needed in our communities, and to be activating your community to be standing up for that. Each person who's trying to build housing has an entire community of people that you know that could be brought into actually advocating in their community for building more homes. And I think that that's something that I hope people are inspired to do.
I'm inspired to do it. I'm going to sign up and I'm going to be proactive with you and the YIMBY movement. I want to give you a chance to give your own outro. Tell me what the goal of YIMBY is and tell the world what you want them to know.
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate goal is that we have abundant, sustainable, affordable communities where everyone can thrive, where we have both subsidized, affordable, and market rate housing, where we have integrated, sustainable communities, where different kinds of people live near one another, share with one another, go to school with one another, where the ladder of opportunity is so present. We've done so much in society to pull up that ladder of opportunity to sort of separate ourselves from people who are different from us. And the ultimate goal of the YIMBY movement is an integrated, sustainable community where anyone can thrive. I look forward to not working on housing. I think housing is step one for that vision. It is what we need in order to make that vision possible. There are going to be so many other things, but that vision is impossible so long as the chronic housing shortage continues. There is no ability to solve our homelessness problem. There's no ability to solve our segregation problem. There's no ability to solve our school problems. There's so many other systemic problems in society that the chronic housing shortage makes impossible to solve. And so the first goal has to be solving that housing shortage in order to make that abundance future possible.
Laura, when it comes to housing, what does attainability mean to you?
Attainability to me means housing that is both affordable and near jobs and opportunity. You can't have one without the other. People have to be able to both afford housing, which, statistically that means something less than 30% of their income spent on housing. It also has to mean that you have the opportunity to not engage in mega commuting, to be living close to where there is opportunity for you to personally thrive. I think that these words of attainability and sustainability and walkability and being able to live in a whole community where you can walk down the street and get a coffee and go to the grocery store, that is a bigger vision of what attainable housing can mean. Attainable housing is kind of meaningless if it means you're commuting 6 hours a day to your job. It has to mean something more holistic than that, where you can live in a community where you are not ground down by other features of the lack of housing, near jobs, and opportunity.
Laura, I want to have you come back periodically and give us updates as we measure our progress through 2030. And I'm so grateful that you're on the podcast today. I want to just say YIMBY Action is yes to people, yes to housing. Thanks for being with us today, Laura.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think MultiGreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.